What is the meaning of life? This is the quintessential philosophical question. Albert Camus takes one look at it, throws back his head and says, of course life has no meaning, but what does that matter? Whereas philosophers like Nietzsche, Sartre and Kierkegaard either ran from or fought against nihilism and asked how we can find meaning in life despite everything, and nihilists and pessimists argued that life was not worth living and that we must fall into despair, Camus asked that we push past nihilism to discover what is on the other side. In his words, we must ask, is it possible to live without appeal? Can we look at the meaninglessness of the universe in the face and stand there, unflinching, laughing at it? Camus says the answer to this is yes, and he calls this philosophy absurdism. Most people stop their analysis there, but I think there's a real depth and radicalism to Camus' philosophy that goes untouched by a lot of popular conceptions of it, and I would like to explore those aspects here. Before we get started, remember that this is just my interpretation of Camus, and it's not the definitive word on the issue. My aim is not to end a conversation, but to start one. But first of all, his philosophy is called absurdism, so what's so absurd? 1. The absurd. Camus' entire philosophy rests on this one idea, the absurd. But what exactly is absurd? Is it us? Is it the world itself? Camus says that it's neither of these things in isolation, but that they come together to form the absurd. The absurdity in question arises from humanity's eternal search for meaning. We search for it in God, we searched for it in objective moral theories, and we search for it in the twinkling promises of the Enlightenment. But at each juncture, fully satisfactory objective meaning was not granted to us. In many parts of Europe, belief in God gave way to atheism. Morality was philosophically undermined by thinkers like David Hume and Nietzsche, and while Enlightenment thinking provided many brilliant things, it could not answer the human call for meaning. This is because, according to Camus, there just is no meaning in the world. No matter how hard we search, it will never be found. How would we even know if we'd found it? When we look for meaning, we're searching for something intangible yet universal, something that is everywhere and nowhere, imperceptible yet somehow discoverable. The very concept of meaning bars us from finding it. This tension between man's search for meaning and the universe's stubborn refusal to cough up the goods is the great absurdity of life. And this is what Camus means when he talks about the absurd. The absurd is when you keep asking why until there are no more answers, but the urge to ask remains. If you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. Camus talks about the absurd as a driving force behind much of human behaviour. He says it is behind religion and morality, and implies in many of his fictional works that society is in an eternal state of running away from the absurd. In his novel, The Stranger, much of the action takes place around a man on trial for a murder. Despite early assurances that he'll probably get off pretty much scot-free, he is eventually condemned to death. The court passes this lofty sentence not because of the severity of his crimes, but because of the attitude he shows to them. He just will not play ball with the court's idea of morality or what is proper to do. He displays no remorse, not in a malicious way, nor in a psychopathic way, but simply because there is no objective ethic in his mind to condemn him. He does not even hate the people that have sent him to die. The only thing he resents is the idea that he should condemn himself or bow to a higher power. And his radical honesty about his view of the world is what causes the judge and jury to send him to the guillotine. For Camus, society is deeply fearful of the absurd, and they will do anything to run from it, including executing people they would have otherwise spared. Camus likewise sees the hand of the absurd in religious faith. Using the example of Kierkegaard, he says the religious answer to the absurd has always been to throw reason to the side for a moment and to embrace something beyond rationality. That is, to embrace God. Kierkegaard argues that the solution to existential angst is to use God to answer the questions of meaning that reason cannot. But Camus is fundamentally dissatisfied here. After all, what if you cannot throw aside reason, even for a moment? It is all well and good to ask people to take a leap of faith, but what about those that cannot bear to jump? He levels the same charge at Nietzsche, who attempts to solve the problem of nihilism with the drive to improve and to love one's fate, to forge new values in the fires of the old religious ones. I have a whole video on this, which I'll link in the corner, but Camus points out that again, this will not solve the absurd. After all, what do you base these new values upon? Many people want an objective, metaphysical answer to these questions, and Nietzsche is not interested in providing one. Of course, Nietzsche would also probably call you a wimp for expecting such a grand metaphysical answer, so there is that. The point Camus is trying to demonstrate here is that neither religion nor philosophy actually solves the problem of the absurd, and this is because he thinks they begin from a misguided premise. We should not be looking to answer the question of meaning in the world, but learn to let go of that question entirely. 2. Dissolving questions. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein used to say that the only sensible answer to some questions was to stop asking them. Camus says this is what we must do with our question of meaning. The world will not give us the answers we so desperately seek, so the only way to alleviate our suffering is to stop seeking those answers. So, say you're a person in the middle of making a cup of tea, when all of a sudden you realise that life is meaningless and fleeting, and the universe is a cold, uncaring place devoid of objective values. Camus says you have three options ahead of you. The first is to run. For God's sake, run. What are you doing making tea? You have a dire philosophical issue in front of you and no time to solve it. So you leap into the arms of a meaning-giving idea and then try not to question it too much. You appeal to something greater than yourself that requires some degree of faith. It might be a belief in God, or a political ideology, or a set of moral values. Camus calls this philosophical suicide. While he does respect it as a human approach, he sees it as giving up on the philosophical project altogether. The second route is to run it in a physical sense. That is, to end your life. Please do not do this. Camus frames his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, as addressing this fundamental issue. If life has no meaning, why not just end it all? Camus considers this answer to the absurd, but ultimately dismisses it, and I am inclined to agree. It is less solving a philosophical problem than just despairing in the face of it. And I think any philosophical outlook that just says, well, die then, leaves something to be desired. At the very least, as a philosophy of life, it is self-refuting. Finally, Camus offers his solution, which is not to run away from the meaninglessness of life, but towards it. To recognise that the question of meaning has no answer, and then just move on with your life. He encourages us to live without meaning, and without appeal to a higher power, but at the same time, to not fall into the despair of nihilism. Instead, he wants us to push nihilism to its breaking point, and come out the other side with a smile on our faces. We are to learn to live without meaning, and somehow do this without that lack of meaning getting us down. It is something of a tall order, and I will say later how I think substantially more work can be done on how exactly we are to achieve this. But Camus' solution does two things very well. First, it does not shy away from life's meaninglessness. Whether you have managed to find your own meaning in the world, the question of how to live without meaning at all is a substantial one, and Camus' philosophy does allow a way to theoretically do this. Secondly, it is ultimately life-affirming. It does not argue that ending our lives is the answer. Some might call this the bare minimum that a philosophical theory must have to be worthy of the name, but it is still a strength, and not one that all philosophical theories live up to. But what are the immediate benefits of the absurdist position? Well, that is our next move. 3. Liberation. Think about the number of things that you don't do because of either societal pressure, values, ethics, judgment from your peers, or a feeling of guilt. Camus offers freedom from all of these constraints and more. He astutely points out that almost by definition, with objective meaning comes some form of restraint on your actions. If you're a firm believer in the Christian God, at the bare minimum you cannot go around nicking people's stuff and murdering people. And at a maximum you must abstain from sex before marriage, conduct yourself in a certain manner, refrain from judging others, and obey all sorts of other behavioural rules. According to Camus, this restriction is not besides the point, it is the point. All systems of objective meaning must prescribe and proscribe behaviour in some way, because the question of life's meaning is inexorably tied up with how to live that life. If an answer to the meaning of life does not guide your actions in any way, it just would not be a satisfying theory. So Camus here is raising an objection not just to religion, but to any philosophy which attempts to give the world objective meaning, rather than move past the whole messy business altogether. But, embodying the French ideal of liberté, Camus is willing to trade meaning for freedom. After all, according to Camus, with the giving up of meaning comes the giving up of values. Camus' absurd agent is fundamentally indifferent to what is right or wrong, good or bad, pro-social or anti-social, productive or counterproductive. This goes a step further than Nietzsche ever did. Whereas Nietzsche asks us to question and reconstruct our values in light of a godless world, Camus seems to want us to move past the whole concept of values altogether. And this is an aspect of his philosophy that I rarely see talked about online. Probably because it is difficult to overstate just how radical of a philosophical development this is. It is not just replace objective values with subjective ones, but move past values altogether, at least as we currently conceive of them. Think of some of the classic ethical problems in philosophy. How do we live a good life? What is the right thing to do? How can we be good people? Camus dispenses of all these questions with a shrug and just says, what does it matter? In his own words, being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom is living. Where lucidity dominates, the scale of values becomes useless. It is no wonder that the protagonist of The Stranger was sent to the executioner's block. This sort of extreme freedom goes beyond moral relativism and straight to the heart of moral absurdism. It is no doubt deeply dangerous from a societal point of view. However, that does not mean we cannot learn from it in some way. We can take on some aspect of Camus' liberatory message without falling into total value neutrality. We can say on the one hand that we have our values, but on the other, recognise that we are, in fact, free to disregard them whenever we so choose. They are values freely selected, not imposed by the world. In one of my favourite scientific demonstrations, an acquaintance of mine, who's a biology teacher, once took a pet ant of his and placed it down on a piece of paper before drawing a large circle around the ant in black ink pen. The ant would go right up to the edge of this line, but would not cross it. It seemed to believe the line of the pen formed a physical boundary. However, once my friend forced the ant to cross the line with his hand, the illusion was dispelled, and the ant roamed wherever it pleased. On one interpretation of Camus, he wants us to rub out the line entirely, but a more moderate idea would be to become the knowing ant, to recognise that the line is just pen, yet choose to stay within its boundaries, conscious that this is a choice. Here we have freely chosen restriction, which I would suggest may grant us the best of both worlds. But it is in freedom from other constraints that Camus' philosophy really shines. After all, most of the time our actions are not restricted by moral values, but by some other force. It might be that we are concerned with the opinions of others, or are embarrassed at ourselves. As I touched upon in my video on Sartre's No Exit, a lot of the time we lose freedom and agency because we're too busy caring what others think about us, and seeing ourselves through their eyes. For Sartre, this was to some extent an unsolvable part of the human condition, and in that video I suggested we might draw upon some Buddhist philosophy to help us out. But Camus' approach is, characteristically, even more radical. He just says, who cares? It is as simple and as profound as it sounds. In response to us saying, I care when people judge me, and it hurts, he just raises an eyebrow and says, well, stop caring then. I think this sort of radical view is why some people claim Camus is simplifying existential issues. But Camus would reply that the issues really are that simple, and it is others that have made them seem more complicated than they need to be. I will touch upon this later, but I think this sort of tension really brings out the strengths and weaknesses of Camus' approach. Some people consider it to be obviously right, and others consider it to be obviously wrong. And perhaps there is no way of resolving this dispute. Perhaps the disagreement occurs at the base level of existential intuition. But at the very least, Camus can make us take stock of just how free we truly are. And we can decide how extreme we want to take this freedom. From simply not letting others get under our skin to completely disregarding morality and values. Anything is on offer at the barbecue of life when Camus is manning the grill. 4. Indifference. The Stoics said it is not things in themselves that hurt you, but your judgments of them. Nietzsche said the key to a joyful life is to love your fate no matter what happened to you. But Camus' philosophy is even more extreme. He just says, who cares what happens to you? Why worry about it? If we do not value people's judgments of us, how can they hurt us? If we do not value our comfort, how can discomfort cause suffering? This is almost a form of Stoicism, but even more radical. Whereas Stoics tell us that what befalls us can only hurt us if we assign those things significance, and so we must be wise about what we assign significance to. Camus asks what would happen if we just got rid of significance altogether. We would be free from all types of suffering apart from our base physical ones, like being too hot or having our arm chopped off. And freedom from suffering entails more freedom in actions. After all, what normally deters us from action is the negative consequences of that action, perceived or real. And what better way to ward off those negative consequences than by refusing to value anything, and to settle into a sort of calm indifference. This principle is again illustrated by the titular character in The Stranger. He is indifferent to almost everything that happens to him. He shows no sadness at his mother's death. Every time his girlfriend asks him if he loves her, he says, not that it matters, but probably not. Even when he is led to the executioner's block, he still does not seem bothered by it, only remarking that he hopes lots of hateful people will be there. This is a man completely indifferent to his own fate and the fate of the people around him. He is an extreme version of the sort of life Camus' philosophy theoretically makes possible. And here is my question to you. How much of this lesson do you really want to take on board? I think a lot of people have things that they just don't want to be indifferent to. They want to care about the people around them. They want to care about their desires and dreams. While there are certain things they'd like to be indifferent about, there are also some things they'd like to be deeply passionate about. To love, to hate, even to suffer for. And I don't think Camus would deny this either. I think that the figure of the stranger, and others like it that he outlines in the Myth of Sisyphus, are instead illustrations of what can be achieved. You may not want to be indifferent to everything, but Camus points out that it is possible to be indifferent to everything. But in spite of this indifference towards the quality of experiences, Camus is an enormous fan of the quantity of experiences. He talks at length about his absurd men, as he calls them, rushing around trying to get to as much of life as possible, all while being indifferent to the quality of the experiences on offer. I must confess, I'm not fully able to resolve this tension in Camus' philosophy, but to have a go, I think he is saying that the person who moves past the absurd and who has embraced life's meaninglessness has more room in their minds for the fullness of every passing moment. Free from existential angst, they're able to experience the present for its own sake, without being distracted by higher principles or judgments. We again see this illustrated in The Stranger. Once our protagonist has fully accepted that he's going to die, he paradoxically gains a whole new lease on life. He savours every moment he has left to live, and talks about how if he had 20 more years he would experience them all in full flavour. He says this all the while also arguing that it does not matter that he's about to die, since everyone dies at some point anyway. This, for me, cuts at both the tension and the resolution in Camus' ideas of being indifferent to the quality of life, while fully appreciating the quantity of life. But whatever your interpretation, I think one key takeaway for us is this. It is always in our power to be indifferent to something, be it social condemnation, a bad day, or a true tragedy. Camus says it's always within our power to shrug our shoulders, proclaim that it does not matter either way, and go and make some toast. 5. But what do we actually do? Camus himself is remarkably quiet on actually how to move past the absurd into his new enlightened age, and he openly admits this. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he says, "Knowing whether or not one can live without appeal is all that interests me. I do not want to get out of my depth. This aspect of life being given to me, can I adapt myself to it?" I think this perfectly illustrates where Camus stops in The Myth of Sisyphus. He is very interested in the possibility of moving past the meaninglessness of life into a philosophically enlightened promised land, but he does not have one answer for how to get there. Perhaps this is what he was referring to when he said he did not want to get out of his depth. But I think it remains a somewhat open question to what extent we can actually learn to live like Camus' absurd agents. What would we have to do to remain indifferent to everything, to be unswayed by societal pressures, to fully embrace our radical freedom? Sometimes Camus seems to think that it is as simple as no longer caring. And to a certain extent, I guess it is. But I also think that this does not do justice to just how difficult it would be to not care about anything. To genuinely look at the empty meaninglessness of life and not either despair or try to construct some meaning out of the leftover pieces. In the closing chapter of The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus talks about the tragedy of Sisyphus, an ancient Greek king who, for his crimes in life, was forced to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to see it roll back down to the bottom of the hill as soon as he'd finished, meaning that he had to push it all the way up again. Camus says it would be possible over time for Sisyphus to find meaning in the pushing itself, to stop aiming for the boulder to stay at the top of the hill, but to make his struggle self-justifying. He is not pushing in service of anything. He is just pushing. And that is enough. So perhaps this is his most powerful piece of advice to us. To recognise that our lives are ultimately in service of nothing, but to continue pushing, and to make our journey through life self-justifying. If life is justified already, we don't need a higher meaning. Everything we need is already in life itself. Just as it is nonsensical to ask what is north of the North Pole, it is nonsensical to ask what gives our lives meaning. The life itself is the whole point. The pushing is all there is to it. And that, I think, is how we can imagine Sisyphus happy. I hope you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to both my channel and my email list for more on thinking to improve your life.